Hey my fellow horror gamers, as 31 Days of Halloween continues, I knew there was one horror series that I needed to review that is built from horror. Today's 31 Days of Halloween review is on the original Splatterhouse. Splatterhouse is a side-scrolling beat-em-up that was developed by Namco and released in Japanese arcades in 1988 and North American and European arcades in 1989. Splatterhouse was ported to the PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16 and released in Japan on April 6, 1990, and was released in North America on April 21, 1990. And one interesting note, Splatterhouse was considered the main reason to pick up a TurboGrafx 16 in North America, and it helped the console gain a small foothold. Splatterhouse was also ported to the FM Talent Smarty, and this version is considered almost arcade perfect, like 99.9%, though there are a few minor things that were changed, and it's really strange why this version is not arcade perfect. But be warned, this port is insanely expensive and in very high demand, and the chances of you getting a copy of the FM Talent Smarty version for a good price is slim to none. Splatterhouse was actually released on Microsoft Windows, but only in Japan in the year 2000, which is something I only recently discovered. The TurboGrafx 16 version was released on the Wii's Virtual Console in North America on March 19, 2007, and the arcade version was also released on the Virtual Console, but unfortunately only in Japan, and this was a shame. The arcade version of Splatterhouse is an unlockable in the 2010 remake or reboot Splatterhouse, though the version on here is running through emulation, so while it's arcade perfect, but there are a few glitches here and there, but it's mostly in the music. Splatterhouse was also released on iPod Touch and certain phones, and one version running off Java-based phones, the mask was actually changed to match the mask in the remake, which is interesting, and the iOS version contains a Splatter Rush mode that has you fighting enemies from both sides of the screen in a widescreen presentation. And that sounds epic. Splatterhouse has a very simple but straightforward story. You play a character called Rick, who is bonded with the Hell Mask, or Terror Mask, which has given him superhuman powers, and he basically has to go through a mansion fighting off all kinds of monsters, and some pretty intense bosses to try and save Jennifer. And unfortunately, Splatterhouse actually ends on a sad note, where you have to kill Jennifer, which was a pretty dark turn for any game to take at the time. Splatterhouse ends with you beating the final boss and destroying the mansion, and the mask transforms Rick back to his normal self and lets him go. Splatterhouse is pretty straightforward with its gameplay. You move left to right and you kill enemies, and there are some weapons you can use, and there are a few different fighting moves including your standard punch and kick. There is some platforming and branching paths, and traps where you can fall into an underground section that is a lot harder to beat, but overall it's honestly a very basic but very challenging game. Splatterhouse had a lot of controversy back in the 90s because, as you can see, it's violent, featuring blood and literally punching enemies' heads off. And while this might look tame today, but back in the late 80s and the early 90s, this was considered gruesome, and some releases of the game actually had warnings on the cover because of how violent the game is. Splatterhouse is simple but a very challenging game. You only have 4 hearts when you start, which is your life meter, and while you can't get more, but when you lose them all, you lose a life. And you only get 3 lives, but you can also score extra lives, but you don't get extra lives too often. If you lose all your lives, you can continue, because luckily there is unlimited continues, but you start back at the beginning of the stage, and if you lose a life while fighting a boss, you have to restart the boss fight. And this can get frustrating because the bosses are challenging, but if you're patient, you can learn the enemy movement patterns, and you will start finding the game easier, and you will be able to make more progress and get further into the game, but it's going to take a lot of practice. I only started playing the game recently, and I have managed to get about halfway, and I know if I keep at it, I will reach the end eventually. Splatterhouse is a really good game, and it's a cult classic, but it's not perfect. Splatterhouse's major difficulty is a major obstacle for a lot of players, and I think there should be more options to adjust the difficulty to give players more of a chance to actually see the end of the game. The gameplay is simple but solid, and the controls are responsive for the most part, though there are a few instances where I noticed in the PlayStation 3 version that the controls were a bit unresponsive, but this could just be an issue in this version. Graphically, the game does look good. I do like the look of the enemies, and there are some really creative bosses, but I noticed certain enemies are the same character model, except with the color palette change. and I really think there should have just been a few extra enemies instead of recycling the same one with a couple different cover changes. The stages do look good, but they mostly feel the same, and I would have liked a little more variety. The music really fits the game, and the sound effects are pretty good, though I would like a few more sound effects when I'm killing enemies. But considering Splatterhouse was released back in 1988, these sound effects are pretty good for the time. My biggest complaint is the lack of multiplayer, don't get me wrong. The single player is great, but I feel having the option for 2 to 4 players would have made Splatterhouse a lot more fun. Splatterhouse is a really good game, and despite the major difficulty, I would recommend you guys check out this cult classic. I give Splatterhouse a final score of 8 out of 10. Come back tomorrow when I review Splatterhouse 2. I'll talk to you guys later. This is the Entertainment Wizard, signing off.